Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first webinar organized by the International Institute for Strategic Studies Asia Office, IISS Asia, as we call ourselves. This is part of a larger series under the auspices of the wider IISS organization. Please do look at our website, iiss.org, for details of other virtual events in this series, because there are quite a lot coming up over the coming weeks and months. I'm Tim Huxley, Executive Director of the IISS Asia office. Our panelists for this webinar are our two IISS Shangri-La Dialogue Senior Fellows for Asia Pacific Security, both based at IISS Asia in Singapore. In the order that they'll speak today, they are Dr. Lynn Kuok and Dr. Euan. This webinar will comprise a set of opening remarks from each panelist, followed by a phase of around 30 minutes, during which we'll welcome questions from our participants. This webinar is on the record and will later be uploaded on the iiss.org website. In advance of this event, we did invite and have received written questions from quite a few participants for the two panelists. I'll pose some of these questions, as many as I'm able to, given the constraint of limited time, but I won't identify the sources of those questions. In addition, I'd welcome live questions from our participants, who are welcome to use the raised hand function. And if I'm able to call on you, I'll do so specifically by name, so you will be identified. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lynn Kuok. Lynn has been with IISS Asia since the start of this year. Her focus is on the international politics, security, and law of the Asia-Pacific region, and she has a particularly strong research interest in the South China Sea disputes. She also works on nationalism, ethnicity, and interreligious matters in Southeast Asia, especially Indonesia, Malaysia, Myanmar, and Singapore. She previously held a variety of appointments with think tanks and research centers in the United States and Singapore, and she is a senior research fellow at the University of Cambridge. She's also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Future Council on Geopolitics. Lynn, we're looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, thank you so much, Tim, for that kind introduction. And thank you everyone for being online with us today. Now, I joined the IISS full-time, as Tim mentioned, in January, and had hoped to meet many of you by now, or at least by the Shangri-La Dialogue, which was originally scheduled for next month. But I guess till all's well with the world again, I'm really glad to have this opportunity to gather virtually. And I look forward to discussions after our initial comments. Today, I would like to touch on two main issues. I'll provide an overview of how I see COVID-19 affecting the geopolitical landscape of the region. And then I'll move on to focus on some recent developments in the South China Sea, as quite a lot has been happening there. Now, on the geopolitical implications of COVID-19, these are still early days of a pandemic that's assessed to last from anywhere between 1 and 4 years. But I think it's nonetheless worth reflecting on its possible implications for the Indo-Pacific region. While much has been said about how COVID-19 is changing the world as we know it, insofar as the geopolitics of the Indo-Pacific is concerned, however, the virus is likely to accelerate rather than displace existing trends. Now, this is not the end of geopolitics as we know it, but rather, in my view, a sharpening of its edge. So the first trend that is clearly accelerating is US-China rivalry. In the earlier days of the virus, I think some were very hopeful that COVID-19 would bring countries together in a sort of kumbaya moment. Countries would recognize that they shared a common destiny and work together to defeat a mutual foe. What we've instead seen, unfortunately, is a descent into nationalist trenches, with each country seeking to forge its own response to the crisis. The United States and China, moreover, are engaged in a battle to push their respective narratives on who should bear responsibility for the virus and its spread. This tussle to control the narrative surrounding the pandemic has taken place within the broader context of geopolitical competition, which continues unabated despite the global medical and economic crisis. In the South China Sea, Chinese activities have not skipped a beat, though I must say that these initially went unnoticed beneath the heavy shroud of bad news on the coronavirus. But more on the Chinese activities in the South China Sea later. The second trend I'd like to highlight that COVID-19 is reinforcing is the propensity for weaker governments in the region to rely more on China. Countries that are already inclined to rely heavily on China for infrastructure and other development needs are, after COVID-19, I think, likely to depend even more on Beijing's largesse. Even if countries manage to escape the worst health ramifications of the virus, I think its economic ramifications will weigh heavily on the region. So Cambodia and Laos, with their close ties to the Chinese economy, will almost certainly continue to rely on China. Other countries that might tilt in that direction too, even as they continue to seek good ties with both superpowers, will be Malaysia and Indonesia. I think those two countries will be quite interesting to watch as they seek to rebuild their economies. Now, the propensity for weaker governments in the region to rely on China is not all related to China's strength, I must say. I think ASEAN's weakness has a role to play too. ASEAN, unfortunately, has yet to move beyond rhetoric towards coordinated action on the ground. Now, a greater reliance on China will mean a further, though not decisive, shift in the balance of power in the region. And that's the third trend that I'd like to talk about. So China's ability to influence bilateral relations as well as ASEAN as a whole will increase. Even before COVID-19, there were already doubts about US leadership in the region. Some of this was linked to President Donald Trump, but such perceptions preceded him. The United States' chaotic response to COVID-19 has laid bare deep structural and societal divisions within the United States. And these reinforce views in Asia that the country's power is declining relative to China's. The United States now has the highest number of confirmed cases of COVID-19 in the world and a Great Depression level of unemployment. Now, beyond the issue of capacity, there's also the question of political will. China affected a leadership role for itself soon after the virus spread beyond its borders. The United States, in contrast, demonstrated neither leadership nor indeed responsibility as it scrambled to respond to the virus, often at the expense of allies and partners. And here, I think no one can forget how, there were reports of Germany or the United States diverting masks from Germany for the United States. Now, one thing that's often been overlooked is how President Trump's labeling of COVID-19 as a Chinese virus has not only led to racism against Chinese communities, but also given rise to anti-American and anti-Western sentiment among the Chinese diaspora in Asia. They object to what they see as American or Western bullying. This will not, in my view, mean a geopolitical shift away from the United States in the short term. Many countries in the region, I think, continue to be very wary of China. But I think such ground sentiment can eventually bleed into or complicate establishment views in the region. The final trend that I'd like to highlight is the increasing importance of middle powers in maintaining the region's balance of power. Japan, I think, has played an important role in this respect. It salvaged the TPP, now the CPTPP, after the United States pulled out. It has also created momentum behind the US Indo-Pacific strategy by outlining its vision for the free and open Indo-Pacific. Critically, Japan also put flesh on the bones of that vision through its efforts to promote economic prosperity as well as infrastructure development in the region. Japanese investment in Southeast Asia currently still outstrips China's, though China is fast catching up. Other middle powers from the region and beyond, and here I'm thinking of several European powers, will also have to pull their weight in the region if the balance of power in the region is to be maintained. To conclude my discussion of how COVID-19 will impact the region's geopolitical landscape, I'd point out that although the virus and how it will be handled is an important factor shaping the region's geopolitics, it is by no means the only factor or even the most important one. The crucial factors at play will remain: first, China's behavior in the South China Sea and elsewhere; second, the reliability of the United States as an ally and partner, and its ability to frame the contest as one that is not only about containing China, but supporting a free and open Indo-Pacific. This makes it easier for allies and partners to sign up to a joint vision. And third, the ability of the United States and middle powers, including Japan and Australia, to offer alternatives or even complements to the Belt and Road Initiative, whether in relation to infrastructure development or, as will become increasingly important in the wake of COVID-19, in relation to healthcare. The Chinese president has wasted no time in talking up a health Silk Road. Health systems and securing critical health medical supplies will look set to become another arena in which great power competition will play out. Now, turning very quickly now to recent developments in the South China Sea. Since December last year, China has, and I'll outline some of the activities, first encroached the exclusive economic zones of Indonesia, Vietnam, and most recently Malaysia. It's sunk a Vietnamese fishing vessel, this was on the 3rd of April. It's harassed a vessel, the West Capella, which was operated by Malaysia's state-owned oil company, the Petronas, in Malaysia's EEZ. And it's also found time to establish 2 new administrative districts for features in the South China Sea in the middle of April. Chinese vessels also continue to keep up a near constant presence around the largest feature occupied by the Philippines in the Spratleys T2 Island. Now, China's activities have not been confined to resource fights with Southeast Asian littoral states. China, as well as the United States, has sent warships and fighter jets to around the Taiwan Straits. I should also highlight that Taiwan's Ministry of National Defense reported earlier this month that China is planning to set up an air defense identification zone in the South China Sea, though the report was unclear about whether this was imminent and has not subsequently confirmed that this is in fact going to happen anytime soon. What can we infer from these developments in the South China Sea? I think clearly these are a continuation of China's attempts to strengthen its maritime claims and control around features. Beijing largely lay low in the first year after the tribunal award in the Philippines case against China in July 2016. But since the first anniversary of the award, its actions have become progressively more egregious, first warning Vietnam about drilling for oil and gas in Vietnam's own exclusive economic zone in July 2017, and again in March and May 2018. But then it took steps even further by actively conducting seismic surveys of oil and gas blocks off the Vietnamese coast from July to October last year. From mid-April to mid-May this year, China has also conducted survey activities in Malaysia's EEZ as well. Until then, Malaysia had mainly faced a near constant but generally low-level presence around Luconia Shoals, which is a low-tide elevation within Malaysia's EEZ that Malaysia administers. The persistence of Chinese activities despite the pandemic underscores how China has long-term strategic interests in the South China Sea. And while oil, gas, and fishing resources are certainly part of the equation, its interests are also wrapped up in broader US-China competition. The South China Sea is critical to China's objectives to achieve strategic depth and reach to defend itself against adversaries and protect access to the critical Malacca Straits. Now, for this reason, it's my view that even if China and ASEAN countries were able to conclude a meaningful code of conduct which is very much in doubt in any event, tensions in the South China Sea will likely remain. And so I think I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to everyone, and I look forward to questions later.
Thank you very much, Lynn. You talked about two very important components of the regional strategic scene there, the impact of COVID and the long-lasting strategic focus for many countries in the region of the different levels of dispute in the South China Sea. Thank you very much. We'll come back to you a bit later in this session for during the discussion period, and we'll hear more from you then. Now over to Dr. Euan Graham. Euan joined us in March this year. His research interests lie in Australia's security and defense policies, maritime strategy and security in the broad Asia-Pacific region, the geopolitics of the Korean Peninsula and Japan, and also the South China Sea. Before joining IISS Asia, Euan was on the staff of research institutes in Australia, and before that in Singapore, and earlier he was a research analyst in the British Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Euan, over to you.
Thanks very much, Tim. Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be in this inaugural IISS Asia webinar. I don't want to take too much time away from your questions, so I'll keep my comments as brief as possible, but I also want to cover two areas. One, complementing what my colleague Lynn has just said, addressing US-China relations in a, if you like, a strategic weather setting context. And then I'll say a little bit about Australia and its current approach in the COVID environment. On US-China, I agree with much of what my colleague has said. Rivalry is intensifying, I think, to Cold War levels. The causes for this are mostly structural, but there is a political element in that I think it's now inevitable that China will be locked into the US presidential election, and that bodes for a bumpy ride for the remainder of 2020. On the Chinese side, I think there's a corresponding temptation for Beijing to lock in gains while it can in the South China Sea and elsewhere, while President Trump remains in office. The possibility, of course, being that he may be voted out in a number of months, and that strategic window for China will then abruptly come to a close. So I think we're in a rather dangerous period, which we could think of as a strategic alert for the remainder of this year. In terms of China's reaction, where I might differ from my colleague is I think that China certainly had a very good opportunity to exert leadership, but I feel it's to employ a sporting analogy, it's missed an open goal in recent weeks and has resorted instead to, I think, a campaign of so-called wolf warrior diplomacy and an active disinformation campaign, which has created self-inflicted damage to its reputation, not simply in the way that it's gone around things, but I think even there are now serious questions being asked from the business community in nations that trade with China about its reliability, both as a supplier and as a consumer. And that is prompting the United States, but now others, to seriously contemplate investments in sovereign manufacturing capability and supply chain diversification. Now, supply chain diversification has been talked about for many years, rather like pandemics, and not much has been done about it because it's costly and it's more difficult to do than it sounds. But I think in terms of political will, my sense is that we are now at a critical threshold, not simply in the region, but globally. If we look at how Europe is approaching China, that we are potentially at a tipping point where I think there will be a change of direction and one which approaches China economically through a lens of strategic risk. So that's the overall context. Just a few comments about Australia now. And Australia, I think, is a good example of the broader phenomenon of COVID-19 acting as a strategic accelerant, particularly in Australia-China relations, which have worsened quite dramatically in the wake of the pandemic. And the trigger for that was Australia's decision to call for an international inquiry on the origins and spread of COVID-19. That then prompted an angry exchange from the Chinese ambassador in Canberra, who divulged a confidential phone conversation with Australia's leading diplomat, and in so many words, threatened economic coercion. Now, that economic coercion has been threatened before, but the difference this time is we've actually seen some follow through in the limited, but I think targeted form of new tariffs which have been applied on imports of barley from Australia. So I think we're in a different environment, and one which has also accelerated the government's public position in terms of warning about strategic risk to the business community. And that, I think, is certainly something that may have happened otherwise without the pandemic in the due course of time. But we have progressed from this in a matter of weeks in a way that I think would not have been possible without the accelerating influence of the pandemic and the geopolitical kickback which it's inspired in Australia's most important relationship in Asia. Two final comments, which I think maybe put it in broader context, but Lynn talked about creative middle power diplomacy. So Australia, again, is a good test case of that. I think the move to call for an inquiry has had more success than was originally feared, because Australia did not appear initially to have much international support, but now it does stand, I think, a very good chance of being voted through the World Health Assembly today, possibly including the support of China. Now, that critics might say is because the objectives have been watered down and the focus of that inquiry has moved away from China to the WHO. But nonetheless, I think we can say it's a 2 out of 3, and at least it's a start for Australia, showing that it's prepared to take an international stand. Finally, I think the regional multilateralism, sometimes it's more interesting to note things that don't happen rather than things that do. I think one critical absence in this period has been the ASEAN Plus framework. It's not entirely dormant. ASEAN Plus has been utilized, for example, to increase rice exports from Korea. But it's noticeable to me that in Australia's diplomatic framing, it's mainly been talking about the global level of multilateralism, much less about ASEAN. There was no attempt, for example, to call for an emergency East Asia summit. And I think that reflects some of the unfortunate shortcomings that Lynn has also alluded to in terms of ASEAN's ability under crisis conditions to actually show leadership, especially where it rubs up against the interests of China. So I'll conclude there and look forward very much to your questions and comments.
Thank you very much, Euan. That's great. Thank you both for your excellent sets of opening remarks. We've now got about 35 minutes for discussion and questions and answers. As I mentioned in my own opening remarks, there are quite a few questions that were submitted in advance. So what I've taken the liberty of doing with those is to try to rationalize and group them into questions for both of you, which are more manageable. And also I'm hoping to see some raised hands from our participants in due course. I've also got a question of my own to start off with for both of you, and it was stimulated by things that each of you each of you said. Now, Lynn, looking at the geopolitical impact of COVID-19 in this region, it occurred to me that one impact that may be interesting in the way that it develops over the coming weeks and months is the relationships, the set of relationships in Northeast Asia, the relationship between Japan and the ROK and China. And over the last few days, there have been some interesting developments there, with virtual conference between the health ministers of the three countries. A lot of talk about exchanges of views on procedures for handling and responding to COVID-19. There's been no talk. There's been no talk about. There's been no pointing of fingers at China. All the talk has been very positive, and the focus has been on cooperation. And then this links in with what Euan was saying about a Cold War or level of animosity and tension. There may be elements of that. I can see that between the US and China, but the question is, to what extent does the US have allies in this part of the world? I mean, I know the technical answer very well, but in real terms, is Japan an ally in the same way that Australia is an ally? There's a lot of talk about decoupling, but can Asian allies and partners of the US afford to decouple from China? And how will they see the impact of US-China decoupling on their own economic fortunes, and what will that do to their attitude towards the US and the West? So really, my question for both of you, perhaps starting with Lynn and then going to Euan, is what about the Northeast Asian angle of this? And are the Northeast Asian allies of the US really likely to be on board with decoupling and Cold War style confrontation? Lynn.
I had myself on mute, which is probably the best way of going about things. I think that I don't think that any of these countries, indeed most countries in this world, would not want a decoupling to take place between the United States and China. I just don't think that they can afford it. You talk about this sort of informal get-together between Japan, the ROK, and China to handle COVID-19, with no mention of, blaming China and, no talk of the United States. But I think I would look at this arrangement as a very practical one that's transactional. COVID-19 is going on. These countries are close to each other. What can the three countries do to help to manage the situation? And I think we've seen similar attempts by these countries in Northeast Asia to put aside differences to handle very pragmatic issues. So when Japan was facing issues with the United States in terms of trade, it sought to, better relations with China. And I think they're all grown ups and they're very sensible about this. But I think once we see security issues arise, I think that's when the true mettle of the Japan or the US alliance comes to the fore. And so Japan still needs the United States in terms of the nuclear umbrella to handle, say, to handle North Korea. It worries about its its situation in Northeast Asia. And I simply don't see it abandoning the US alliance. What I think it's trying to do in terms of bettering ties with other countries is to actually support that alliance by reducing the burden on the United States to do some of the things that the United States, under this administration at least, or under this president at least, has shown itself quite incapable of carrying out or doing.
Thank you very much, Lynn. Euan?
Let's look at Japan first. I think one of the broader lessons of Japan's history is when it's been allied, it's tended to do well. When it's been on its own, it's tended to do less well, and at some point in history has gone off the rails. I think that collective memory is still very strong, and an impulse on Japan's part to maintain the alliance, irrespective of whoever the commander-in-chief in the United States is. From a US point of view, let's flip it around. I think Japan is clearly the most important ally in the Western Pacific if we're looking at the basing infrastructure of US forward deployed forces. If you have no Japan alliance, there is no forward deployed presence that's meaningful to talk about. So I think we've seen an interesting sort of jostling in the Trump administration's approach, with the president's own ambivalence at best around alliances, particularly towards the two Northeast Asian countries, Korea and Japan, with the interest of the bureaucracy and the military that knows very well that if without Japan in particular, the US does not have a forward deployed posture that's meaningful. The second part of your question was around decoupling, and I think a lot really comes down to what does decoupling mean? How far does it go? I don't think we're in any risk of moving to a properly Cold War, economically bifurcated world system. I just don't see that on the cards. I think the decoupling is much more likely to be centered around the higher end of technologies, where I think that's where it's clear that's where the foundation of future power is going to be driven from. And I think interesting that Japan too has engaged in, you could say, a mini version of its own decoupling by recently investing up to $2 billion worth of incentives to encourage its own businesses to move out of China and into Southeast Asia and other places. So I think we see the same logic of economic risk, and I think that's through a risk prism that's the key way to judge it, already affecting Japan independently. So the United States tends to get a lot of flack for having a friction-based relationship with China, but in some senses it's ahead of the curve because I think that the risk element has become more firmly established in the United States. There's an undesirable element to it politically that plays out, I think, very unhelpfully for the allies. But I think there's also recognition that the United States has finally grappled with China in a way that was very frustrating to Japan under previous administrations, where they felt they were overlooked and the United States wasn't taking it seriously enough. Korea is a different type of alliance. So the alliances themselves are different in their nature. It's fundamentally, from a Korean point of view, an alliance that looks towards North Korea, not China. I think there's always been deep resistance on the Koreans' part for being brought into a kind of anti-China US-led coalition. So they've tried to restrict their alliance relationship as far as possible to the discrete challenge focused from the North. But I think their issues are much more around alliance management from the Trump administration, which has actually been a horror show, to put it bluntly, of expecting much higher host nation support payments from the Korean government at the same time when the Trump administration is giving concessions away for no obvious gain to North Korea. So I think we're in a very strange situation where, to use the international relations terminology, the Koreans are fearing both abandonment and entrapment from the United States at the same time. And clearly that's a very bad state of affairs.
Thank you very much, Euan. Well, I now see one raised hand, and I'd like to take that question from Mr. Charlie Brown.
Hi, thanks, Tim. I hope you can hear me. And
yes, very clearly.
Thanks for the presentation from Lynn and Euan. My question was, what are the regional viewpoints and perspective of the recent U.S. operations that we've seen in the news, like a strategic bomber deployment, but also the Navy's operations near the West Capella? Is there a difference between what the U.S. says is their intentions versus what the region understands when they see these operations? Thank you.
Thank you. Euan.
Thanks, Charlie. I think there has been an issue around some of the strategic signaling and strategic miscommunication from the United States. Perhaps the most obvious example of that was the decision to end the continuous bomber deployment in Guam, which I think unnecessarily ruffled feathers in the region just by the way it was communicated. The substance of the US presence in some ways has actually become accelerated. So I think the positive side is that there is an awareness that in this strategic alert time that we're in, the United States is I think doubling down on whatever message of presence it can get out, including publicizing submarine operations, which is a very unusual step to take. But you mentioned the West Capella. This is the drill ship in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. And I think I wrote a piece on this, and I was a bit critical of the United States position because I think that it captures the difficulty that the United States has, not just in deterring China in the South China Sea, but attempting to compel it. I think that was essentially the aim, was to try and compel China to stop its rival survey activity in Malaysia's exclusive economic zone. And the problem was the Malaysians themselves were very ambivalent about that. They did not respond positively. It was a lukewarm reaction. It wasn't entirely hostile either, because I think the Malaysians have a version of what most other Southeast Asian, South China Sea countries have, which is an awareness that they will have to live with China forever, whereas the United States, of course, is there by dint of its political will. And that was exemplified, I think, in the way that a very short-term muscular demonstration of an amphibious-ready group within sight of the West Capella then quickly evaporated as the United States had to go off and cover other areas. And one sympathizes with the Seventh Fleet having to do an awful lot on its patch, including in the Taiwan Strait and the East China Sea. But you can only be in one place at one time. And if you only have so many ships, you're always going to be chasing shadows. And I think that works to China's favor, especially in the South China Sea, because it's a different kind of game. The US can deter high-end conflict in Taiwan much more effectively than it can the kind of low-end strangulation approach that we've seen incrementally increase its control over the South China Sea.
Thank you, Euan. Lynn?
Can I just add to that? I think the thing with US presence operations is that they came a little late, but I think the point is they did come eventually. So originally, the United States was conducting freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea, and it would do them, in the Obama administration, it was probably 4 times a year, and this increased during the Trump administration. The original complaint from Southeast Asian countries was that the United States only cares about this geopolitical battle between the United States and China, and it only cares about its ability to fly through the waters and fly above the air of the South China Sea. Since then, the United States, I think, has actually adopted quite a helpful approach, namely, and that has been to conduct its freedom of navigation operations, conduct presence operations. So when the West Capella was being threatened by Chinese Coast Guard and maritime militia, we saw the United States send its vessel there, not once, but in fact twice. After Euan wrote his piece, I think it returned to the scene again, probably persuaded by Euan that it needed to do more. And apart from these operations, the United States, the State Department has actually issued several statements now criticizing the attempts by China to encroach upon the exclusive economic zone of various littoral states. Vietnam was one case, and recently China's attempts to encroach upon Malaysia's EEZ. So the United States has criticized this. It's also talked about, the tribunal ruling, which I think it's a good, it's progress. So I think the United States is doing better than it used to be doing, and I think littoral states or Southeast Asian countries need to not be so reliant on the United States to do everything, understanding that it is doing something, and also stepping up to the plate themselves. And I understand that the capacity of Southeast Asian countries might be limited, but there are things that they can do within certain constraints that will help the situation. And I think Malaysia's position on warships in the South China Sea has always been a bit iffy, in my view. Last year, under its former foreign minister, it said that warships in the South China Sea were very unhelpful. And of course, this ignores the fact that they have the legal right to fly international waters. And in the case of the South China Sea, where there are militarized features, I think the US, French, UK presence, I think all this is very helpful in seeking to stabilize and counteract militarized features in the South China Sea and ensure that it does not become a Chinese lake, or in fact, a body of water that's dominated by any one power.
Lynn, thanks. Maybe we could just dwell on the South China Sea for a little bit longer, because we had quite a few questions in advance from some of our participants this afternoon, and I'd like to attempt to paraphrase and combine some of those questions and ask you first of all about a big question which extrapolates from what you were just saying, and that is, in the longer term, what more can be done to deter China from acting without a proper legal basis in its activities in the South China Sea and in relation to the South China Sea features that it occupies? And what about the ASEAN-China code of conduct? Is that going to be a useful device? And if you're equivocal or see limitations in terms of the usefulness of the code of conduct, which I suspect you do, well, what else can be done? You talked about ASEAN countries stepping up to the plate, but these are countries which have very deep and important economic relationships with China, so they're not going to go and also I mean, they have no capacity for confrontation with China in a physical sense. So what else can be done, and particularly in view of the I mean, I think an overarching point that you made, which is that China has huge long-term strategic interests in the South China Sea. China's behavior there is not likely to be just a blip. This is a long-term phenomenon. So what can regional countries do to deter or manage China's activities?
So I think you made a very important point in what you said earlier, that ASEAN countries have important economic relations with China, and that's going to continue. And I think everything I say about the South China Sea and Southeast Asia's response to the South China Sea has to be taken into that context. These are countries who are neighbors of a very powerful, economically and militarily powerful neighbor. And so when the media talks about pushback amongst Southeast Asian countries, I think that needs to be taken with, needs to be viewed at in that broader context of Southeast Asia wants good relations with their neighbor, with a powerful neighbor. So what can be done short of an outright physical, kinetic engagement with China, which would really hurt ties and also be self-defeating because they're so clearly outmatched by China. One thing that's being explored, although I don't know how helpful it is going to be, is for the Philippines to bring a legal case against China. Now, we saw how that worked out in the case of the Philippines. Most people were quite disparaging. They said it achieved nothing. But I think actually in the first year, we looked closely at developments in the first year after the South China Sea Award in 2016. In that first year after the award was rendered, I think we saw improvements in China's behavior simply because the world was watching and people were talking about the award. So one possibility is for Vietnam to bring a legal case against China. I think the success of it will depend on how the case is framed. There's a difficulty in that, in the sense that, under the Philippines case, the tribunal found that, the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, and by implication, the other littoral states, were theirs to enjoy without the encumbrance of the Chinese 9-dash line or any Chinese claims of an EEZ from features in the Spratlys. So that helped in Vietnam's case, but if it brings a case in respect of the paracels, there's a large feature in the paracels, Woody Island, and what happens if the tribunal then finds that that's entitled to an EEZ? Now, China occupies Woody Island, and if that's entitled to an EEZ, that vastly complicates the maritime entitlements in the South China Sea, because China is going to be arguing that, Woody Island is entitled to an EEZ, and so China's entitled to certain claims from Woody Island, if not its claims from groups of features in the South China Sea, which appears to be where China is moving these days in terms of justifying its expansive claims in the South China Sea. So that's one possibility. But I think Southeast Asian countries need to continue doing what they are trying to do with the help of other nations, namely shining a light on what China is doing, using its Coast Guard to indicate to China that it's aware of what's going on and it's not happy with what's going on. This is small, I guess it's a small comfort or a small win, but it's better than just lying back and saying that the game is over, because the game is not over in some respects. So there's also the joint, the cooperation on the possibility of cooperation with China in terms of oil and gas development. That is another possibility where if countries would agree to a suitable deal with China, then these countries would be able to gain the benefits from the exclusive economic zone without completely ceding the area to China.
Thank you, Lynn. Euan.
Thanks, Tim. You asked about the code of conduct. No, I have very little faith in it, for the obvious reason that those countries that do not have a stake in the dispute are not going to ruin their relationship with China out of solidarity with those that do. So I think that asks a question of the ASEAN claimants, and there are 4, Vietnam, Brunei, Philippines, and Malaysia, but a 5th quasi-claimant, Indonesia, in fishery terms at least, through the exclusive economic zone through Natuna. And Indonesia, I think, is really at the heart of everything that ASEAN does. If Indonesia is engaged, ASEAN looks more effective. If Indonesia is looking within, then ASEAN looks weak and divided. And I think that's the reality is that we have an administration in Indonesia that is not really playing a strategic game or an outward-looking game. It's more focused on its own domestic economic issues. So I don't think much will change. But when we do have a change of administration in Indonesia, ASEAN could look more effective again for that reason. But I think the four plus, if you like, a Southeast Asian claimant quad plus Indonesia would be the obvious way in which policy could be coordinated. They need to put their own disputes aside because they also dispute each other's jurisdictions. But there's obviously a great deal more at stake with the dispute with China. And they have, as Lynn said, international law in their favor there. So use that. And if you can't compete on the water, compete in the public space. Go to the media. Don't be silenced. I think that's the criticism I might have of some of the Southeast Asian governments where, yes, they're not playing, it's a David and Goliath game, but one asymmetric factor that they can use in their favor is publicity. The final point I would mention, and it goes back to the United States, we have the Philippines now apparently committed to scrapping the visiting forces agreement with the United States. To downgrade your military alliance with the United States in the current situation does not make a great deal of sense, I think, to any outside observers. So the Philippines should certainly, I think, rethink doing that. And the other Southeast Asian countries can do what's possible to share that burden. Singapore hosts 2 littoral combat ships, which have been mentioned already, but there's precious little of that elsewhere in the region. And I think that really comes down to Southeast Asians being caught in this wanting to have their cake and eat it world in some ways, that the United States will always be doing too much or too little. There is no magic sweet spot. But they can at least, I think, help the US to do what it's no longer able to do because its bases were closed down 20 years ago.
Euan, thank you very much. I see another hand raised. Euan Kubashev.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for this possibility to ask the question. I have the following question. In this new real world and regional economy and the RC regional comprehensive economic program planning to be enforced by the end of the year, how do we see the future of the WTO? Is it already something of the past, or it still have some perspective? Because this year a ministerial conference was postponed until next year, and the perspective are very gloom. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would either of our panelists like to tackle that question on RCEP and the implications of RCEP for the usefulness of the WTO?
I'm afraid that's beyond my competence, Tim. I mean, I think the RCEP is a relatively weak free trade agreement. I think it's lost some steam with India's decision to pull out. But I think this comes back down to what middle powers can do. I think in the absence of leadership from the United States and with China applying strings attached to the aid that it offers, making the best of not just RCEP, but the TPP-11, which still exists. I think that's rather receded into the background, but I would hope that signatories, including Brunei and Vietnam, are able to maximize that agreement.
Thank you very much. Lynn?
No, I have nothing to add to that.
Yeah.
I would I don't see, I couldn't really hear the start of the question, but I think it was whether or not the current dynamics would hurt RCEP. And I don't really think that it will, simply because it's, as Euan said, it's a relatively weak trade agreement, and it doesn't really threaten anybody that much. And so China's in favor of it. I think it's going to go ahead.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a couple of military-focused questions here, and one of them relates to something that you've written about fairly recently, Euan, and that is how the COVID pandemic will affect the defense sector and armed forces of Southeast Asian countries, and also the wider region. But I think the real focus for the question was on Southeast Asia.
Sure. I think that's that length of string is still yet to be determined, because it depends really on the economic damage, and the effects of COVID in Southeast Asia are defying predictions. So I hesitate to say that it will be a systemic change. We have some data points already, however. Thailand was one of the first to announce that some of its signature acquisitions, including the second and third of its submarines bought from China, were going to be shelved. Elsewhere, I think we can expect more public pressure for spending on welfare and health systems, just as in other countries. So I think there will be a groundswell of pressure to divide the cake in ways that meet popular needs in the face of a pandemic that's going to be around for several years, and that's inevitably going to squeeze defense budgets. But I think it's the geopolitical sting in the tail of COVID-19 that's going to temper the strength of those cuts, particularly in countries with deeper pockets and ones that are committed to spending on defense by policy as a percentage of GDP. So Singapore leaps to mind, but also Vietnam. Vietnam is worth highlighting, I think, as one of the winners within Southeast Asia, both for the strength of its public health reaction, which along with Taiwan was one of the most effective in Asia, or the world for that matter. But I think that Vietnam is going to continue to modernize its armed forces with the South China Sea as a driver behind that, because I think it doesn't cancel out their threat perceptions from China, and China is doing, if you like, every bit it can to reinforce that perception.
Thank you, Euan. Anything to add, Lynn?
I mean, I agree with what Euan said. I think in the near term, we're going to see countries in the region place a priority in fighting the pandemic and increasing resilience to future pandemics, as well as seeking to get the economies back on track after COVID-19. But I don't see, given the increasing geopolitical tensions, countries dramatically reducing their military spending in the medium to longer term. And quite apart from those tensions, say in the South China Sea, etc., a lot of the militaries in Southeast Asia are very important, important parts of these countries. So if you look at, Thailand or Indonesia or Myanmar, I cannot see defense budgets going down too much beyond the next 1 or 2 years.
Okay, thank you very much. We're coming towards the end of this session, unfortunately, but we've got time for one more question. It was one of several questions related to Taiwan, which was sent in advance. We haven't really talked about Taiwan during this webinar, but there is an important question, and that is about the future of Taiwan's international status and Taiwan's security. In a way, this is a a fortuitous time for Taiwan, because there is an administration in Washington which is rather extraordinarily pro-Taiwan, and we've seen within the last few months the passage of the Taipei Act and other indications that both the administration and Congress are highly supportive of Taiwan's security and its and defensive in relation to its existing political status. I mean, how do you think Taiwan might further advance its international status and its semi-sovereignty and its security, given that there is a sympathetic administration in Washington? How could Taiwan build on developments over the last months and years? Lynn?
The question of Taiwan is a very difficult one. I'm not sure I'm the best person to be talking about this. However, I think what Taiwan has done has been quite savvy. So pushing, for instance, for observer status in the WHO assembly meeting that's taking place, in fact, today. So using, in essence, I think Taiwan has been, the hurdle that Taiwan has faced has been the one China policy. And if it is able to creatively get around that, so that de facto it participates in more multilateral organizations, etc., I think it would have done a good job. So for instance, in the case of the Code of Conduct in the South China Sea, Taiwan is one of the claimants in the South China Sea, and it also occupies the largest feature, Taiping Dao or Itu Aba. It has the Asia Pacific's one of its largest fishing industries, and it also sends vessels regularly to patrol the South China Sea. It is quite sensible for Taiwan, in fact, to be part of a code that manages relations in the South China Sea. And in fact, I would argue that it would make complete sense for the other parties of the Code of Conduct to seek to admit Taiwan, perhaps not as a full party to the Code of Conduct, but as an observer or as a guest, as Taiwan is in the case of ICAO. So there are ways of getting around the one China policy, which in theory doesn't reach that. The problem, of course, is political will and the political appetite to possibly incur the ire of China. And in this respect, I would simply say that relations between Taiwan and China are at an all-time low. The US has shown itself quite willing to bare its teeth in relation to Taiwan vis-a-vis China. So I think China actually does have an incentive, if it were to be sensible about it, to seek to include Taiwan in some of these gatherings or multilateral institutions, so the Code of Conduct and WHO. So once China shows that it is not going to make huge objections, then the others might follow. So in the case of the Code of Conduct, hopefully Southeast Asian Southeast Asian members of the Code of Conduct would be also more willing to open their arms to Taiwan. Of course, the difficulty is that Taiwan has sought to make clear that there is daylight between its claims and China's claims in the South China Sea. But I don't think that the message has been noticed as much by Southeast Asian countries.
Thank you, Lynn. Euan?
I think China's not going to be sensible about Taiwan, but China's lack of sensibleness has actually helped Taiwan enormously, because I think it's shone a light on Taiwan as the other China, if you like. The one that it's been able to fill the vacuum of those questions around reliability as a supplier, I think the big economic, but it's also a strategic opportunity, is for Taiwan to look for gaps to fill in supply chains. Now, it's not going to be able to replicate what China can do on scale, but it does have important leads. We've seen in recent days that, in fact, the United States has already started that process with chip manufacturers being onshored into the United States with involvement from Taiwan. And I think that trying to get into the economic framework of the region, maybe the breakdown of multilateralism will actually act in Taiwan's favor. If we're moving into a more disaggregated international environment in Asia, where the ASEAN plus the East Asia Summit is actually less prestigious and less commonly meeting than was the case before. Taiwan's very good at being able to move through the cracks in the international system, because it has to do that out of survival. But I think there are certainly opportunities for it, and it's already, I think, shown the ability to maximize those gains and become a kind of positive foil to China's mistakes on provision of medical equipment, and I think there will be other opportunities for Taiwan to do that in future.
Thank you very much, Euan. Unfortunately, it's time to bring this session to an end. It's been a great webinar. Thanks to you both, Lynn and Euan, for your excellent opening remarks and responses to the questions. I think you've really shown the breadth and depth of your expertise across a range of regional security issues. Thank you very much indeed. I know that we'll be seeing a lot more of you over the coming months and years in future webinars, and hopefully before long in real life seminars and other events organized by IISS Asia. I'd also like to thank all our participants in this webinar, and especially to those of you who asked questions, whether in advance or during the session itself. And we look forward to seeing you all again before too long. Thank you very much, everyone. Goodbye for now.